about the syllabus and give you some more information about the course. So please feel free to stay behind. Let's see how many people are in. Okay, most people are in. Okay, so this morning, what I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time touching on three topics that I think are important as background and context for the individual issues that we're going to look at. So the first one deals with some of the key players in the environmental movement. And just as a heads up, everybody, I put a short reading on D2L, on TCU Online, on these people. Incidentally, it's from an earlier edition of the book, and I have no idea why I took this out of the new edition of the book. I'll probably put it in next time again. But anyway, setting that aside, it's a short 3-4 page reading that goes over some of the people we're going to talk about in just a moment here. So that's the first topic this morning, is to look at some of the key players in the environmental movement, at least from an American perspective. And I think this is important because their philosophies relating to the environment are some issues that we're going to touch on throughout this course. So that's the first one. The second set of topics, the second theme this morning, deals with environmental ethics and some concepts around how do we value the environment and how do we put a price on nature. Again, that is a theme that we're going to weave throughout the course. And then the third one is the scientific method. I know this is an environmental science course. It comes with natural science credit. And some people, at least my experience in teaching this over many years, is that some people have a fear of that, right? They sort of are a bit hesitant when it comes to doing something that's science-based. So my goal here is to kind of ease some of those potential fears, building around a science course. So those are the three issues that I want to go over. Let's see how we do for time. I don't expect that we will take up, probably much to your disappointment, I don't think we'll take up the full almost 2 hours this morning, but I'll give you a break about midway through and let's see how we go. I can't promise that we'll end early, but we may well do. So that's where we're headed this morning. As always, as I said yesterday, please feel free to interject and ask questions if there's something that's not clear. And then also as a reminder, your first short discussion post is due tonight. So again, if that wasn't absolutely clear yesterday, then feel free to ask me on those. Okay, so let's start with issue number one this morning, a very brief history of environmentalism. Okay, so here are two grand looking gentlemen. One person here you should recognize, maybe both, but the person on the right is who? This rather jovial, smiling, laughing guy.
Theodore Roosevelt.
Yeah, so that's President Roosevelt. And it's just my bias, but I think well, I'm not a US historian by any stretch of the imagination, but I love President Roosevelt. I think he, up with Lincoln, those are the top two in my books. And again, my bias comes from what he did for the conservation movement, really founding it, is that the right word? Well, hugely influential in a number of areas as it relates to conservation. So the person on the right is President Roosevelt. The person on the left is Gifford Pinchot, P-I-N-C-H-O-T, also an interesting guy, worth looking up on Google. They were friends. Pinchot was a forester. So he went through the Yale School of Forestry, and his first job was in the US Division of Forestry. The Forest Service that we know today hadn't been founded yet, right? So this is the late 1890s. He actually incidentally later became the governor of Pennsylvania. So that's aside. He was friends with Roosevelt before he became president in 1901, I guess. Pinchot, in his work in the division of forestry, both of these men subscribed to a philosophy or a belief that our natural resources should be conserved but used, right, for the greater good, for the good of humankind. In other words, our resources should be used wisely, but should be used to support economic development and the needs of human beings. That was a conservation ethic that these two gentlemen very strongly espoused and developed. They were the champions of this. And when McKinley was shot and President Roosevelt takes office in 1901, from 1901 to 1909, he does many things, but again, of relevance to this course, are a number of executive orders that President Roosevelt signs relating to conservation, to setting aside huge areas of land, putting it into the public trust, putting it into the oversight of the federal government. He incidentally, I think he signed something like over 1,000 executive orders during his presidency, but many of these executive orders were to claim land for conservation. And it's important to stress here, everybody, conservation and use, right? This is not setting up national parks. President Roosevelt didn't do that. In 1905, President Roosevelt starts the National Forest Service. So the Division of Forestry becomes the National Forest Service in 1905. And Pinchot becomes the first director of the National Forest Service. The kind of mission of the Forest Service then, and in many ways still is today, this is a piece of writing from Pinchot, focuses on the art of producing from the forest whatever it can yield for the service of man. Now that sounds, I know that sounds sort of very, human being dominance over nature, but it wasn't, in the sense that the Forest Service, Pinchot, Roosevelt were all focused on the conservation of nature, again, but the use of that for us. So according to President Roosevelt, resources should be used for the greater good, for the greatest number, for the longest time. And in fact, President Roosevelt was of course a Republican, a conservative, and those first few letters in the word conservative really, I think, undermine and emphasize Roosevelt's focus and drive for setting aside land for resource use and conservation. So this approach is referred to as utilitarian or pragmatic resource conservation. That is the ethic and the mission of the US Forest Service. Utilitarian, meaning for the greater good; pragmatic, again, for our use. And interestingly, if you look at just a map of the forest reserves at the end of the Cleveland presidency in 1897, this is the state of forest reserves in 1897. A decade later, this is the extent of our national forests following these executive orders by President Roosevelt and the establishment of the US Forest Service in 1905. Something like 150 million acres of land is set aside for national forests, for replanting, for use, for the sustainable use of our forest resources. So that's an important benchmark, right, is President Roosevelt Gifford Pinchot, the establishment of the US Forest Service. Then along comes this guy, John Muir. So this is someone that you may or may not have heard of. So the photograph on the right is an extremely famous photograph of John Muir on the right and President Roosevelt, again, on the left. So I don't know if any of you have read any of John Muir's work, A 1,000-Mile Walk to the Gulf, you know, so well known in terms of his nature writing. So Muir was a Scot, born in 1838 to a very religious family. When he was 11, his family moved to the United States. They moved to Wisconsin. And he started university there at the University of Wisconsin. He never graduated, but he was a very keen observer of plants, writing. Again, he came from a very religious background. And Muir really became the most influential environmentalist sort of champion of nature in the late 1800s. He undertook this amazing hike from Kentucky to Florida, not along any path. He just went out one day, kind of like Forrest Gump, and just started walking from Kentucky to Florida. It's an amazing book. And so an incredibly keen observer, but again, grounded in very, very deep and strong religious beliefs. He believed Muir's approach to the environment was not one of conserving nature for the use of human beings, but as that nature had a right to exist in and of itself, and that we as a species, human beings, should engage with nature from a kind of spiritual, religious, transcendental approach, right? And so he believed that we get regenerated and all God's creatures have equal footing on the planet. So John Muir's ethic, and President Roosevelt thought he was awesome, right? He read all of his works. Muir's ethic was not conservation, but preservation, right? The preservation of nature, that we should have our hands off and just enjoy it. And Muir he traveled around the US. He eventually moved out west to Yosemite. He was enthralled by Yosemite, by the area. It wasn't a national park at that point. And he was also appalled by the use of the Yosemite Valley for grazing, in particular for sheep grazing. And he was extremely concerned that sheep grazing was going to overrun the place and that we would lose this magnificent cathedral. In 1892, he and a couple of other people started what was called the Sierra Club, right? And then some of you may have heard of the Sierra Club. That is an environmental organization that is still going very strong today. They were going to call it the Alpine Club because these were just a bunch of people who enjoyed nature, enjoyed the outdoors. They loved hiking and they wanted to walk around the mountains, but they called it the Sierra Club, and John Muir was the first president of that. And incidentally, how this photograph came about is that President Roosevelt wanted to go out west and meet Muir and go camping with him for a night. It ended up being a 3-day camp in 1903. And there's some really good book. There's some interesting stuff on YouTube if you're interested in this kind of thing. It's often referred to as the most important camping trip ever taken, right? It's the camping trip that changed the United States. And this is a quote from President Roosevelt: "I do not want anyone with me but you, and I want to drop politics absolutely for 4 days and just be out in the open with you." There was this kind of bromance, if you like, between John Muir and President Roosevelt. They both loved the outdoors. They both loved nature, but they had fundamentally different views of how we should engage and use nature, right? Muir's was spiritual, Roosevelt's was utilitarian. So Muir's approach to the environment, everybody, is often referred to as moral and aesthetic nature preservation. And it's summed up in this little quote here, right? Nature's object in making animals and plants might possibly be, first of all, the happiness of each of them. So each organism, each plant had a right to exist in and of itself, and that we had no right as the dominant species to abuse it. So both of these views, both Muir and Roosevelt, or Muir, Pinchot, and Roosevelt, all agreed, right, that we should, they were all against kind of, wanton destruction, overgrazing, deforestation. They all understood the importance of nature. They just came at it from different perspectives, right? One was a pragmatic use-based one, so reforestation and using the forest for the resources, for lumber and the economy. The other one was an aesthetic nature preservation approach. And then incidentally, Yosemite becomes a national park later on, right? After Yellowstone. And then the National Park Service is founded in 1916 as a result of all of the work of Muir and other people, for sure. And so those two organizations, the National Forest Service and the National Park Service, are today's manifestations, if you like, of the early kind of formulation of these organizations by people like President Roosevelt and John Muir. Any thoughts, any comments, any questions? That makes sense, right? This isn't the moment that environmentalism started, but I think for me, these people in this period from the late 1800s through to the early 1910s, 1920s, as you see the evolution of conservation and preservation and the formation of organizations like the Forest Service and the National Park Service. You can't go into a national park and start cutting down trees, obviously. So they're very much in line with the original formulation. All good, makes sense. Okay, so that's a little bit about Roosevelt and Muir. Then, of course, we go into a rather difficult time, right? We have World War I, we come out of World War I, the Great Depression, we go into World War II, and then, as I mentioned yesterday, we come out of World War II, the global economies come out of World War II into what we call, the Great Acceleration, right? So the real industrial revolution post-World War II drives global economies. And then along comes this person, Rachel Carson, who for me is the next key figure in the environmental movement. Someone you may have heard of, and a book that you may have read. I don't know if any of you have read Silent Spring. So Rachel Carson publishes in 1962, 63, this book called Silent Spring. And it's now really viewed as kind of the launch of what we see as modern environmentalism. Rachel Carson was an extraordinary mind, a biologist. And again, you can read up on her and learn a bit about her easily online, but she writes this book, Silent Spring. And Silent Spring, really for the first time in a public space, articulates the issues surrounding human impact on the environment, specifically relating to pollution and pollutants like DDTs and pesticides that were being used to chronically over-fertilize our crops to increase yields, and how those pollutants and those pesticides migrate into the food webs, right? She explained, I think, and articulated for a general audience things like bioaccumulation, how pollutants begin to accumulate in organisms, biomagnification, right? How pollutants begin to magnify up a food web as higher and higher predators start eating more and more of the organisms down below. And so she really, launched, I suppose, as you can see, it says on the cover of this re-edition, it launched the environmental movement, no doubt about it. Now, the 60s, of course, is an extraordinary decade in and of itself, right? We've got the Vietnam War, protests against the Vietnam War, hippies, Jimi Hendrix, Woodstock, flower power, all that good stuff. So the 60s is is really kind of seen as this sort of what we call this decade of awakening. And it culminates in 1970 with the first Earth Day. So that occurs on April the 22nd, 1970. So the 1960s, following on from Rachel Carson's expose on pollutants, launches the Earth Day, and the early 1970s, incidentally, and we'll come back and talk about this a little bit as we go through this course, everybody, launches a number of, kind of stimulates Congress, the US Congress, to enact a number of very important pieces of environmental legislation, right? The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Coal Reclamation Act, the Endangered Species Act. All of these pieces of legislation focused on the environment during the early 1970s, following this kind of awakening, if you like, of the environmental movement. And then finally, in terms of, the environmental movement, I think what the early 1970s does, or at least from 1969 onwards, I don't think we can really overstate the importance of space flight and putting a human being on the moon, and that first image looking back at our planet, right? This is not that image. This is a more recent, higher resolution one. But that moonrise shot that the Apollo astronauts take of this amazing little blue ball out there in space, a realization that perhaps this really is it, that this is our planet and that we should take care of it. And then launching, further spaceborne monitors like satellites, and in the 1980s, of course, space-based platforms, remote sensors, Hubble telescopes. My point simply is that we have been able, over the last 4 or 5 decades now, to provide really high-resolution data to a number of fundamental environmental issues, like deforestation, for example, right? Since 1970, we've really been able to map out and monitor at increasing resolution the rate of deforestation. We now have instruments that can measure the concentration of atmospheric gases from space at an incredibly high spatial and temporal resolution. So I think this kind of sort of bookends or summarizes this century and a bit of environmental work, being able to look at the planet and understand that we really are all truly interconnected, right? That pollutants don't obey political boundaries, especially in the atmosphere, but also as pollutants are moved around by our watercourses. So that's, as I said, a very brief, and what is that? That's 25 minutes. That's a catastrophically brief overview of kind of key themes and people in the environmental movement. Any thoughts or comments or questions from any of you as we move on? Does that sort of make sense? Anybody want a clarification? All good. Mass silence. Okay, I'm gonna have to start picking on people. All right. So that's the first theme of the day, right? Steward of the environmental movement. The second one that I want to talk a little bit about, and I don't want to get, especially into an area here of philosophy, but I want you to start thinking about these things as we start unveiling and unpacking these individual environmental themes, right? So environmental stewardship, the conservatorship of the planet, how we manage our resources, environmental ethics, and environmental science. And so this is kind of I hope the thought-provoking question for the morning, right? And that is, how do we achieve, if indeed we should, but I believe we should. So how do we achieve a balance between human values and interests on the one hand, and our obligations and responsibilities to nature on the other, right? I said yesterday, mentioned I think somewhat in passing yesterday, that we face some very difficult conservation decisions because we don't have an open checkbook when it comes to conservation, when it comes to preserving nature and species and wildlife and so on. There's not enough money to go around, right? And so we have this extraordinary century, the 20th century, where our population goes from, 1.5 billion to just under 7 billion people in the space of 100 years, right? Or just less than 100 years. Now we're at 7.8 billion people. And as we'll talk about tomorrow, everyone, we are absolutely inevitably heading towards 9.5 and maybe 10 billion people, right? I think we have responsibilities to those people, right? I assume that the next 2 billion that come along are going to want food and water. They're probably going to seek out energy, which at the moment means carbon, right? And so there are a whole host of responsibilities to human beings. And how do we balance those responsibilities with our responsibilities to nature and the natural world? We used to build fences to keep animals out, right? When population numbers were low. And now we build fences to keep them in game reserves and nature reserves and so on. Because as we will see, as we go through this course, we have had such a dramatic impact on the landscape and the appropriation of things like forests for agriculture, large-scale agriculture, and cattle grazing, that we are impacting habitats dramatically, and that's the most significant land use change that we can affect as a species. I think is to change and to fragment habitats. So there are all sorts of, I think, complicated questions here when it comes to conservation and to conserve species. And so, here's one of them, right? Here's kind of the question and just a couple of my thoughts. What should we protect when we're conserving and managing wildlife? Now, as I mentioned yesterday, I started the TCU Rhino Initiative in 2014. And so I've been very involved in the conservation of rhinos in South Africa in particular. Black rhinos are one of the big five, right? The so-called big five game. Anybody know what the other four are? Have you heard that term, the big five? Yeah, Cole, I see you nodding. Well, the giveaway is on the screen, right? So the big five animals are rhinos, actually black rhinos to be more correct. Elephants. What else? Anybody?
Buffalo.
Lions.
Buffalo.
Yeah. One more. Lions, buffalo, elephants, black rhinos.
Leopards.
Yeah, thank you, leopards. So those are the five. Those are the big five. And I kind of hate that term, to be totally honest, because a lot of people come to South Africa or Southern Africa and they're like, all right, I don't want to see anything else. I just want to see the big five. I have to check these big five. They call the big five, incidentally, because these were the most dangerous animals to hunt on foot traditionally. I don't know why hippos aren't in there, because, man, those things are grumpy and quite dangerous. But nonetheless, so we have these human constructs like the big five or the glamorous seven or whatever it is, and rightly or wrongly, those are the species that tend to get the attention, right? If I'm totally honest with you, these are my favorite. I love elephants. I had the privilege 3 weeks ago to do a procedure on an elephant in South Africa. A huge matriarch of a herd about the size that you see on the screen here. And she had to have her collar changed because we track these animals so that we know where the herd is, and we look at where they're going and the resources that they're using. And I can't tell you, I mean, it's really hard to articulate. And if I get time at the end of the course, I'll share some videos with you. But it's very, very hard to put into words what it's like to lie down on an elephant, right? To put your hands onto an elephant's tummy and just lie there whilst this incredible creature breathes, whilst you're changing its collar and checking its blood and making sure its antibiotics and its contraception is in place and all of that, right? So I mention that because those are the kind of animals that we tend to go to first, right? Save elephants, save rhinos, save pandas. But that prioritizes these big glamorous herbivores, these megafauna that really are impressive and glamorous, and perhaps puts down in a second tier or third tier or fourth tier other species that are not just from John Muir's perspective as equally valuable, but from an ecosystem functioning perspective, they're even more valuable, right? Rhinos are not what we call a keystone species. What I mean by that is a rhino isn't a species that props up the functioning, that is the foundation of the functioning of an ecosystem. Yeah, they're important. White rhinos are grazers. They're sort of big vacuum cleaners, and they walk across the African grasslands, and they keep the grasses short. And there are birds like oxpeckers that sit on the back of them and feed off them. So there's an importance for sure. But there are other species that are keystone species. Now you think of pollinators are functionally incredibly important from an ecosystem perspective, right? So what should we protect when we're managing wildlife? Okay, there really isn't a single answer. And I've just highlighted these two terms here. Yeah, we have different values, right? People put different values on different species, and there are different prioritizations, okay, which are problematic. For example, I went to a meeting in Singapore, and it was on human-wildlife conflict. And in Asia, South and Southeast Asia, that's often couched in terms of human-elephant conflict, right? And so we've got people from Africa that are lamenting the fact that Tanzania, for example, a country right next to Kenya, has lost something like 60% of its elephant population in the last 5 years. Then you've got people from South Asia going, we've got way too many elephants here, right? We've got to do something about it because these elephants are trampling and eating our crops, and they're walking through neighborhoods, and they're damaging buildings and cars. And so there's competing values. There's different viewpoints on how wildlife is viewed. So I'm not going to give you anything more here or any sort of take-home answers here as it relates to this. I just want you to keep this in the back of your mind. There are some there are points in this course, everyone, that will address this specifically. We're going to talk about biodiversity, right? And I am going to talk about the rhino crisis, and because that's what I have some experience in. And I realize that that is my bias to try and preserve this one single species. But that's a choice. That's a prioritization that we've made here. And that creates disagreements because some people think we should be focused on other ones as well. So let me see if anybody's got any thoughts or comments on that. Incidentally, is there anybody online here in the course that is involved in wildlife and conservation in any way? I'd just be interested to see if anybody has worked or works in any biodiversity related area or topic.
We have a family property in South Texas, and we manage the deer population and kind of create habitat for quail.
How big is the property, Duncan?
Excuse me?
How big is the property?
I think about 1,000 acres.
Okay. Yep. Pretty good size. Yep. Yep. My wife's family has a ranch down near College Station, about 300 acres, and it's an Audubon certified, and they've got some cattle, and they also have some conservation work going on there. Anybody else? One of the things we'll come back to as well. Let me just see. There's a chat going here. Multiple family members are game wardens. Cool. That's from Matthew. One of the things I will address again a little later on. So this morning I'm just trying to give you a flavor of some of these kind of dilemmas and things we'll talk about. But one of the things we'll talk about later on when we look specifically at biodiversity and protecting wildlife and the biodiversity crisis is how we view that in a place like South Africa or Southern Africa through a Western lens, right? We have our conservation ethic. We look at wildlife through a US-based lens. So Duncan and his family, what they're doing down in South Texas, you know, that's a particular lens through which they manage, which you manage your property. That is not necessarily at all transferable to the management of wildlife in a place like the Eastern Cape of South Africa, right? There's a whole different set of issues that are relating to wildlife management there. So I just throw that out there, and we'll talk about that. The other one, just incidentally, I know someone, I can't remember who it was, so I apologize, but someone yesterday mentioned hunting. Can't remember who it was. Someone was a hunter. That's a really interesting topic that we're going to talk about when it comes to the preservation of species. And it's something that I get asked about, you know, all the time. And I'll talk very openly and honestly about hunting as a conservation model in South Africa. And when I say that to a lot of people and a lot of my friends, they'll go, what do you mean hunting is a conservation model? How can hunting be a conservation model? You're hunting, you're shooting animals. And I'm like, yeah, but if it's done ethically and properly and legally, and they go, what do you mean ethically? How can you hunt ethically? You're killing animals. My point simply is that we have to look at conservation in a broad, holistic viewpoint. And hunting is part of that. And I hope we have an interesting conversation when it gets to that point. Okay, so that's just a little bit about kind of what I think about in terms of wildlife conservation. The other thing I want to just mention here, and we'll talk a little bit about this, and then I'll give you your first break, is I always like to, I do this when I'm doing this class in person as well. I like to just spend a minute relating what we're going to talk about in this class. And don't worry, folks, this is not going to be 3 weeks of philosophy, not at all. But I think it's important to think about what we do in our classrooms here at TCU and how that relates to the mission statement of the university and what we try and do as a university, right? So the mission statement of TCU is to educate individuals to think and act as ethical leaders and responsible citizens in the global community. The colors and the underlines are my own. And I put this up here because one, it makes me smile and think back 20 plus years. I was on one of the committees to work on and develop the mission statement of TCU. And that was an amazingly long and complicated process. You know, if you want to drag out a decision, put a bunch of faculty in a room and let them have at it, right? And everybody has their view and everybody wants their 2 cents. The chancellor at the time, the chancellor before Victor Bushini, wanted a mission statement that he could put on a coffee mug, but a mission statement that we would agree would be a meaningful kind of umbrella to how we go about our business. So to think and act as ethical leaders and responsible citizens in the global community. When this came out, I was personally delighted. Why? Because it felt like they had written this for the Department of Environmental Sciences. I mean, we vote with our wallets every single day. We impact the planet in some way, both good and bad, every single day. Responsible citizenship, global community, and ethical decision-making, to me, is about how we live, you know, how we go about our lives. The challenge, I think, when it comes to the environment, okay, is how do we know what constitutes an informed and responsible decision, right? When it comes to the development of our planet and the use of our resources, because if we want to keep economic development going, we need to continue to use and conserve our resources. How do we know what constitutes an informed and responsible decision? And sometimes we simply don't, right? This all falls within the scope of this branch of philosophy called environmental ethics. And environmental ethics is it's a discipline, it's a sub-discipline in philosophy that really looks at the moral relationships of human beings to and also the value and moral status of the environment, okay, and its non-human content. So I know that's kind of a long-winded little definition from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, but I really think it's important, right? The moral relationships between human beings and the non-human world, okay? And the value that we place on that. And I'm going to come back and just talk a little bit about value in just a little bit, okay? So you look at a landscape like this, right? Now, I don't know about you folks. I don't particularly, I don't find this a particularly beautiful landscape, right? I don't think John Muir would stand on the edge of this open pit mine in Australia and go, ooh, wow, this is absolutely fabulous, right? No, but we are using this from a resource extraction perspective. And this is a zinc mine, and that's being used and smelted and creates jobs and drives the economy. From an environmental perspective, one question would be, does the company mining this land, right? If you put yourselves into the position of the CEO of this mining company, does your company have a moral obligation to restore the landform and the surface ecology? A moral obligation, once you've mined this area, to then go back in and fix it, right? I don't know, okay? I don't know the answer to that. Legally, in many parts of the world, the answer to that is yes. For example, we're going to talk on Friday about energy, and we're going to talk about fossil fuels, and coal is one of them, right? In the US, there is an act called the Coal Reclamation Act of 1977. And what that act mandates is that if you as a coal company go in and mine, like you see here at a surface mine, or if you blow a mountaintop away to expose the coal seam, you are legally obliged, morally maybe as well, but you're legally obliged to restore that landscape to its pre-mined condition, and you sit there and you go, yeah, right. How's that going to work? How are you going to restore a landscape or replace a mountain or fill this big hole in, okay? So very often it doesn't happen, okay? And equally, when we think about that term value, and that's the term I want to just focus on for a second here, what is the value of a landscape that has been restored compared to a natural one, right? Sometimes, can you get very close to a pre-disturbed landscape? Possibly. So let's just look at this term value, okay, and how we use the term value when it comes to the environment, okay? And it comes down to whether something is worth something or not. Okay, so this is $1 million. This is a pile of cash. Here are the Benjamins, and this is $1 million, right? This pile of cash has a value. Okay, and that value, of course, is what we would call instrumental value, right? It's got an instrumental value because it is printed with units of 100, and that has been tied to a buying power. Those individual $100 bills or that pile of cash can be traded in and can be used to buy something, right? There is an instrumental monetary value, okay, as a means to an end, if you like. It provides a means to an end to buy something, okay? So there's an instrumental value, right? Then we look at this, okay? Here's a landscape that means a lot to me. This is a photograph I took from a little lookout on the game reserve that we work at in South Africa, in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, okay? It's a lovely morning, but cloudy, a little bit of rain in the air, nice little rainbow. This is what fills my gas tank, okay? I wake up, cup of coffee, look out there, and I'm like, fantastic, right? What kind of value does that landscape have, right? Well, in my world, in the world of environmental ethics, there is an intrinsic value to this landscape, okay? An intrinsic value, a value that goes beyond any kind of dollar amount that you can put on it, all right? A value that is a means in and of itself, not an ends to a means, but that is the means itself, right? That it provides inspiration, refuge, a connection, if you're a religious person, a connection to a higher power, whatever, right? There is an intrinsic value there that you cannot really put a price on, okay? And those two values are the two values that we always struggle with from an environmental perspective, the instrumental value and the intrinsic value. What I mean by that is, so take a look at this this photograph, right? This is another one of my favorite spots. So I'm sitting here on the banks of the Sarapiquí River in Costa Rica. And if any of you have been to Costa Rica, I hope you have. If you haven't, make sure you do, okay? Costa Rica is an extraordinary country, developing country, wonderful people, some of the most progressive environmental regulations in the world, and of course, some of the most incredible landscapes and rainforests. And when I take students to Costa Rica on the study abroad trip, we go whitewater rafting. That's cool, right? And then we get off the rafts and we have a lunch sitting on this riverbank. And I get the students to think about these questions, right? When you look at this landscape, okay, do you see instrumental value in this landscape? Let me ask you guys that. Can you see anything in this landscape that you think would have instrumental value?
Water.
Yeah. Okay. Why do you say that, Matt? What about that?
Well, water obviously can be used for multiple purposes, but it can be used for energy.
Okay.
It can be taken, and if it's, obviously all the bacteria run out of it, you can use it to drink. So
Right.
It has, value beyond just the look of it.
Okay, good, right? Absolutely. The fact that we were spending $50 a person to a company to put a raft on the water, there's a use there, there's an instrumental, value that's going into the economy there. Absolutely. Yep. Anything else on that landscape that you think would have instrumental value besides the water?
Yeah, it could be a food source.
Yep, absolutely. And it is, Jet. It is. Local fishermen. Yep.
I would say everything in this picture, because it is also part of, animals' habitat.
Okay.
Home, having a home in an ecosystem, and keeping that in check is very important for the well-being of animal populations.
Right.
I got another one. You can use the rocks. You could sell the river rocks for something like a bathroom or something.
Huge business. Absolutely, huge business. I'm impressed and glad you noticed that. So in channel gravel mining, that channel bar that you see on the left there, that hasn't been mined, but further upstream it has, right? People love these rocks, full bathrooms, bar countertops, hot tubs, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Then there's those things called trees, right? There's some of the most valuable hardwoods in these forests, almond trees that people cut down. They make the most incredible furniture, right? So yeah, absolutely, all of that, nice. Your points are well taken. There's a whole lot of instrumental value in this landscape, right? But of course, I would argue that there's a whole lot of intrinsic value too, right? There's value there of just sitting on the river and just sitting, just being, and looking at those ecosystem services that are being provided free of charge. Those trees are producing oxygen, right? That water is probably acting as some sort of nutrient filter, okay, as are the rocks themselves. There's a whole host of ecosystem services. That's an important term, right? That we talk about. So this question of, how much is this river worth? Yeah, you can put a price on certain things, on gravel, on trees, on lumber. Someone may say, okay, you know what? We're going to put a small hydroelectric plant in there and we can generate electricity. And we could probably add that all up and come up with a dollar amount, okay? And then there's going to be someone that's going to go, well, how do you cost the other stuff? How do you cost the intrinsic upliftment that you get from just experiencing this river, okay? And that may sound maybe kind of silly. I don't know if it does or doesn't, but it's an area that causes a lot of discussion and debate in the environmental, world. Is it wrong to put a price on nature, right? Can we really, truly put a price on the natural world, okay? Now, some people, and they generally fall under the kind of umbrella of what we call ecological economists, say we absolutely should, and that if we don't put a price on nature, we won't know what's worth saving and what is worth letting go, right? And a report that came out, it's come out quite frequently, but one that came out in 2020, it's called the Living Planet Report, said that nature is worth $125 trillion. You go, wait, what? How did they come up with that, right? How do you put a price on nature? Well, if I just back up a minute to the early 1990s, there was a really controversial paper that came out that tried to do this. They looked at the world's ecosystems from an ecosystem service perspective. So in other words, if you lived in Brazil, for example, and you looked at what the value of the fishing industry in Brazil is, right? What are the marine resources? What are the forest resources? What would it cost to kind of replicate all of the ecosystem functioning and the nutrient cycling and the clean water? And this report, it was really controversial because it said, well, nature is worth something like $33 trillion a year. And that was the first time that anyone had really tried to put a dollar figure to the value of nature. And of course, this caught the headlines in the New York Times, nature's worth $33 trillion and so on. Now it looks like it's worth more. And again, I'm just throwing this out there because, if this is a topic that interests you, this is a great read, right? The Living Planet Report, and not only what nature is worth, but how we are eating away at that, right? How we are reducing the value of nature by over deforestation, overforesting, overfishing, by the amount of garbage that is being collected in our oceans, by the amount of topsoil that's being lost. So this is known as the Living Planet Index. I'm not going to ask you this in an exam or anything, but I just want you to be aware of it. It's kind of the state of the art, if you like, that suggests global species have declined. The value of global species have gone down by something like 2/3, right, since the 1970s. And we will look at this as we work through this course. So in lab today, for example, at 10 o'clock, when you get together with James, you're going to be talking about your footprint, all right? And looking at how we calculate our environmental footprints. And don't beat yourselves up if your footprints come out to be big, because I can tell you, mine is huge, right? The cliff notes, the giveaway, if you go right to the end of my book, I think my current footprint is about 4.5 planets. It takes about 4.5 Earths to support my current lifestyle, okay? And that's a tough reality to swallow. And we have to acknowledge that and figure out how we change it. So that's the first 2/3 of this morning. And I think that's a good point to take a little break. So let's take a 10-minute break until about 9:05-ish, something like that. And then we'll come back and we'll deal with science and science as a way of knowing. Any follow-up thoughts or comments or questions on that? And that stuff. All good. Okay, I'm going to put the recording on hold. Incidentally, I don't know if anybody saw it, but I do put, okay, everybody, let's keep going and cover the third topic this morning. We'll take about half an hour to do this. So it looks like we may be able to give you a little early release this morning. So the third topic is this word science. And again, I know I won't assume there's anxiety over this being a science course, but I have found that a lot in teaching this course. And when it comes to exams, I often hear, well, I didn't really test very well because I'm, not very good at science. So let me hopefully try and relay some of your fears here when it comes to, if indeed you have any, when it comes to science. So what does it mean to be scientific. And you may have heard of this term or this phrase, it's been shown scientifically that, or it's been proven scientifically that. Well, when we think of science and being scientific, maybe this guy comes to mind, okay? Pretty smart dude, Albert Einstein, one of the great scientists of the 20th century. Okay? Others may think of this guy as being scientific and as being the poster person for all good things, as it relates to science. And both of those may hold some truth for sure. There are certainly a number of people that I've come across, my students, who feel that science is just this big, mysterious, incomprehensible thing, right? And it really does, to be serious for a minute, it does impact how people approach a course and how they study and how they perform in a course. So let me say just at the outset, right off the bat here, that science is just simply a way of gaining knowledge, right? It's a way to look at the world, okay? One of the tools that we have, the overridingly most important tool, is a method called the scientific method, and I'm going to talk just briefly about that, right? But if we follow the principles of science, then it should be a discipline that is systematic, okay? That is precise, and that is objective. Precision is extremely important, and at the end, I'm going to talk about precision and accuracy just for a moment, because those two terms are important when it comes to assessing data. We're going to look at quite a lot of data and graphics in this course. And so, for example, when we look at something like climate change and global warming and temperatures in the 20th century, we need to be thinking about how accurate and how precise are those measurements. So I'm going to just park that for a minute and come back to that at the end. Objectivity is an important one. I don't know about you, but I know that there is generally a perception that scientists must be objective, right? That they must be neutral, that we are unbiased, right? That we put on our white lab coats and what we do is kind of sacrosanct and is not open to question and is not open to sort of the geopolitics of the day. And I think that's a little naive in a sense, right? Because I do believe that we live in a world now that is a really polluted science communication environment. And it's becoming increasingly difficult, I think. That's just my personal opinion. I don't know how you all feel about this, but it's becoming more and more difficult to just do the science and present the science and not advocate for your science, right? And that opens up a real can of worms when we're asked to do a study, or for example, I'm consulting at the moment on a couple of lawsuits in Texas on flooding, right? And I've been asked to provide all of the terms on the screen here are valid, right? I've been asked to provide a systematic, objective, accurate, precise, unbiased view as to whether the plaintiffs in one case and the defendants in another case bear responsibility for some very high-profile flooding. So I'm very aware of these types of terms because very often the work that I do ends up in a court of law. And there you can't beat around the bush. You can't sit back and go, well, let me think. I'm not quite sure. You've got to be able to defend your work, and it has to be governed by scientific principles, I guess is what I'm getting at. But of course, we live in a world of instant gratification, Snapchat, TikTok, Twitter, all of these things, where stuff gets put out immediately. And if it's put out on the internet, or if it's put out on social media or Facebook, how many times is it just retweeted or shared without people sitting back and going, I wonder if this is valid or not, right? So that's just my own personal little plea is is to take a break, take a breath, and look at where your sources are and try and verify whether the work is scientifically sound or not. There is a whole lot of what we call junk science out there, right? Faulty scientific data, which are undoubtedly used to advance special interests and hidden agendas, no doubt about it. Special interest groups and lobby groups are misappropriating all sorts of really good, solid science, okay? So, so that's important. This is a really important topic for a course like this, and really for any course in the sciences, is how do we evaluate good science? How do we evaluate junk science? And make policy decisions based on, we hope, good, sound scientific principles. Okay, so fortunately, we have a set of tools in our little scientific toolbox that constrain us, right? And that's known as the scientific method. So here's just a very simple example of the scientific method. You probably know this. This actually happened to me during Snowmageddon. The lights went out, the electricity goes out, and you know, being a really poor planner, I hadn't planned anything. So I grabbed my flashlight. I remember doing this next to the bed, and I hit the switch. Dead, nothing, right? Okay, so I tried again, the flashlight is dead. So what are the first things that come to mind, right? Well, you probably think, okay, well, it's the batteries, that's a possibility. Okay, it might be the bulb, it might be the switch, okay? So first thing you do is you scramble around, knock over your drink, find some batteries, put it in, and hey presto, it works, okay? What we've done there in a very, very simple and crude way is what we call the scientific method, okay? An approach that allows us to come up with a solution based on a well-defined premise. So the premise is simply to make an observation, right? Ruh-roh, flashlight doesn't work, okay? To come up with a hypothesis, or maybe multiple hypotheses, right? In my case, it was, well, it might be the batteries, might be the bulb, might be the switch. Let's run a little experiment here to test out these variables one by one and see, okay, hypothesis one, it's the batteries. Let's change the batteries, the flashlight comes on, accept the hypothesis, you solve the problem, right? That is the scientific method. In a slightly more formal way, this is what this looks like, right? We make an observation, we ask a question, right? Boy, I wonder why this is going on. Let me form a hypothesis. So a hypothesis, everybody, is an educated guess. That's all it is, right? It's an educated guess and is, within the constraints of the scientific method, something that is testable. So what do? You conduct an experiment, you change out the variables one by one, and if your experiment supports your hypothesis, then you accept it, right? You don't prove it. There is no such thing as scientific proof, okay? That may just seem like semantics, but you accept your hypothesis, you reject any alternative hypothesis, and you move forward. Knowledge is gained by the level of how robust your hypothesis is and how robust your experiments are. If you have to reject your hypothesis, you conduct your experiment and it does not support your formulation at the outset, then you've got to go back to the drawing board. Either you have to come up and test another hypothesis, or you have to reframe the question, or your observation is wrong, or your experiment is unsound, or whatever the case may be, right? But that is the scientific method. Now, of course, not everything is open to this type of experimentation, okay? You know, geologists, for example, my colleagues on the second floor here, they look at plate tectonics and continents moving around and the rock cycle. You know, we can't conduct an experiment. We can now on computers and digital modeling, but it's pretty hard to conduct an experiment and push continents around, right? So there's other forms of reasoning. But from a scientific perspective, this is the method that constrains us, okay, on whether we can accept or refute a hypothesis. And with evidence from a number of investigations, okay, we can come up with a theory. So that's a really important term, guys. A theory, right? A lot of people assume that a theory is an educated guess. It's not. All right. A theory is a well-constructed proposition that is supported by a number of different studies. Okay. So the hypothesis is really the educated guess based on the observation. The theory is what develops from a number of related investigations that continue to accept and support the original hypothesis. And from a theory over time, if that stands the test of time, you come up with a general principle or a law, right? So for example, you know, we're pretty sure about gravity. Every time I throw this pen up, it comes back down, right? That's a law or a general principle, okay? There is a chance that I may throw this pen up and it may go straight up through the ceiling, okay? It's an infinitesimally small probability, okay? But it is a law and a general principle. So the law of gravity, for example. So just remember that, because we're going to talk about, you know, controversial things like, again, climate change or global warming, and people get these terms, you know, mixed up. Is that just a theory? Is it a general principle? You know, we talk about evolution, right? The theory of evolution. Why do we call it the theory of evolution? Well, it's a very broadly conceived, logically coherent, and supported concept, right? It doesn't mean it proves everything or anything. And it doesn't mean it isn't open to verification. And it doesn't mean there are things that are left unexplained. Of course that it does, right? But it is a broadly conceived, coherent, and well-supported concept that really importantly clarifies our understanding of the world, right? So at the moment, the theory of evolution and natural selection and mutation is the best explanation for what we see in terms of species evolution, right? It doesn't mean to say there may be something else out there that does a much better job of explaining it. But right now, that is our current understanding of the evolution of species. So these are the concepts of which we're sure, most sure, may be tested, they may be verified, but again, not proven, right? And I don't know how many times you guys have heard this, probably a bunch of times. You see this in the medical world, right? They say, well, drinking 2 glasses of red wine is bad for you. And no sooner do you hear that, then you find some study that says drinking 2 glasses of red wine is good for you, okay? So on that front, I prefer to err on the side of caution for the second hypothesis. But there's all of the time this conflicting material out there. And I think we've seen that probably with the development and the speed at which the development of the vaccines, COVID-19, has come out, right? People are hesitant in some groups to get vaccinated, rightly or wrongly. And you know, there's uncertainty about long-term effects and all of that. But those vaccines have been developed based on the scientific method and the testing of the efficacy of that. So here's a topic again that we're going to look at, you know, in a fair amount of detail, and this one is uncertainty. Okay, so this is one that is, I think, really important to appreciate, because it's another one that we're going to come up against time and time again in this course. Okay, so what are we looking at here? So this diagram shows global surface temperature changes from 1900 through to about 2018. That's the black line, right? Let me actually just put the little annotate thing on here, because this is pretty cool. What color should I use? I'm going to use green, right? So here's temperature change, okay, in degrees Celsius. And this curve here is the observational change for the 20th century up to 2018. Okay, so that is 1 degree, that's a half a degree, that's a half a degree. So here we're looking at about a 1.5 degree change in surface temperatures over the last 120 years, right? The colors here, the red, orange, blue, and dark blue, are the predictions of what global temperatures will be by 2100, based on global climate models, right? folks, we don't know what global temperatures will be in 2100 until we get to January the 1st, 2100. The point is, we have to, or we are being pressured, I suppose, maybe that's not the right phrase. We're being asked to implement policies to combat climate change based on an 80-year period about which we don't know anything yet. Okay, does that mean we do nothing? No, what it means is we have to now turn to the best available technologies that we have, which are some fairly well-constructed, robust climate models. These are 4 scenarios from various models based on various CO2 emission scenarios, right? We're going to come back and examine carbon dioxide in all its glory a little later on in this course next week, right? But carbon dioxide is greenhouse gas. That's not up for debate. And we know that we're putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as a result of human activity. That's also not up for debate, to be totally frank with you, right? What we're not sure about is where global temperature change will be by 2100. Some models put global temperature change at 4 degrees Celsius. Some put it at about 2 degrees Celsius. Some put it at about another 1 degree Celsius. These are the ranges of potential global warming, right? So we're over here. And what this is saying is that we may go up by about another 1 degree to about another 4 degrees. Guys, that's a really broad range, right? As we will see when we talk about long-term climate change, what do temperatures have to do to start an ice age? You only have to drop global temperatures by about -4 degrees Celsius on average, okay? So these are annual averages. When you do that decade after decade, and it averages out to about -4 degrees Celsius, that's enough to instigate an ice age, to initiate an ice age. So a 4 degree warming, right, up at the top here, is going to be catastrophic by any metric. There's no way around that. My mouse has just died, so let me just plug it in. So why this range? Okay, what do we do about this? If you're a policymaker, right? If you're in Washington, D.C. and you're being asked to implement policy based on this, how do we reduce carbon dioxide? And the scientists are coming back and saying, well, global warming is going to be anywhere from not very much to potentially catastrophic. What do you do? How do you evaluate that, right? And the reality is it's because of uncertainty, right? And uncertainty, yeah, there's uncertainty in exactly how well the climate models are replicating global temperatures, but we think they do a pretty darn good job. My point is uncertainty is just part of the scientific method, okay? And it's something that we just accept. We try and minimize it. Yeah, we try and narrow this down, right? We try and reduce this uncertainty to try and come up with a target that is much more certain, okay? But sometimes we can't. Sometimes it just, as we say nowadays, it is what it is, right? There is uncertainty in the way in which the atmosphere works. Let me show you an example here, a couple of examples that happened pretty recently. This is August of last year, okay? So August of last year, on Sunday, August the 23rd, we had this storm sitting out here. Again, let me just put the annotate on. It's a bit unwieldy to use this. So we have the storm out here, right? Tropical storm Marco is centered north of the Yucatan Peninsula at 7 a.m. on Sunday, right? It was predicted to be a hurricane at 1 a.m. on Monday, and it was predicted to be a tropical storm system making landfall somewhere here around southern Louisiana at 1 a.m. Tuesday, right? So I'm just showing you the atmospheric forecast here. This spaghetti-looking diagram on the right shows tropical storm Marco right here, okay, with a range of potential trajectories, right, all from the National Weather Service models. But they're all sort of beginning to coalesce around the Mississippi Delta here, round about New Orleans. So within 48 hours, they were expecting to see this tropical storm make landfall, right? You probably don't remember this. So let me just, oops, annotate, let me clear that. So what happened, right? It was supposed to make landfall in Louisiana. Here's what happened. Nothing. Okay. Tropical storm Marco took a left turn and died. It was supposed to be here as a hurricane on Tuesday. It was here as nothing on Tuesday. Only one model said, yeah, it's going to make landfall and go in this direction. Then suddenly, 24 hours later, all the models saying, well, you know what? Don't worry, my bad. It's all going left. Okay. So what is the, in terms of confidence in a forecast like that? They go, well, now let's not get too worried about it. And then this happens, right? So then we get to Tropical Storm Laura. So this is the same time, Sunday, August the 23rd. Laura here is at 8 a.m. It's over here, right? Coming out over the Dominican Republic. It was supposed to be a tropical storm, develop into a hurricane at 2 a.m. on the Wednesday and make landfall in southern Louisiana. And here's all the spaghetti diagrams, right? 2 a.m. Thursday, make landfall in southern Louisiana, and bingo. Not only does it make landfall in southern Louisiana, it's a little more left of its track, but it's not just a hurricane, it's now a major hurricane, right? So we've got the same week, 23rd of August last year, a warm Gulf of Mexico, 2 tropical storms, and 2 very different forecasts, right? My point simply is that uncertainty is something that is given, it's just a given, right? It's something that we have to deal with and that we have to embrace and have to figure out how much confidence we put into a particular data set or a particular forecast, right? So that's uncertainty. So our measurements incorporate variability, right? Things are variable, guys. We know that, right? I work in a lot of different areas. I work in water quality. I measure stream discharges. Every variable we measure has some degree of variability. And we report that uncertainty as some sort of acceptable level of error, okay? So what is the phrase when we go into a court of law, right? If you're in a court of law, you are assumed innocent until proven guilty. And what's the phrase that follows that? There's a phrase that follows it in legal terms. You're innocent until proven guilty. 4 words.
In the court of law.
Yeah, there are 4 words. You are innocent until guilty. Beyond?
Beyond reasonable doubt.
Beyond all reasonable doubt. Yeah, thank you. Right, beyond all reasonable doubt. Okay. So in a court of law, that's one thing. In my world, dealing with environmental data and environmental sciences, what is beyond all reasonable doubt? How do we quantify all reasonable doubt, right? Well, we quantify it using levels of confidence, okay? And what's the standard level of confidence we use in the sciences? Anybody
95%.
know? Yeah, thank you, 95%, right? So that is a statistical confidence band that gives us a very high degree of confidence. Guys, if you're interested in the impact of say arsenic on whether it would poison someone, you don't want to come up with a study that says, you know what, we're 51% confidence you're going to survive. I don't like those odds. Thank you very much. I want something a little more robust than 51%. So 95% is the gold standard in the sciences and the environmental sciences. In other words, we run experiments. We incorporate variability and uncertainty. We follow the scientific method and come up with a 95% confidence band. In other words, there's a 5% probability that we might be wrong. For medical studies, you got to go beyond 95%, right? You want 99% or above, okay? For sure, right? And so you see that in the efficacy, for example, of the COVID vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna, right? They've done these studies that show it's 90 to 95% effective. Okay, so that's the ballpark confidence intervals that we work at in the environmental sciences. For life and death and health situations, would it be great if we could come up with 99% effective? Of course it would, but we're simply not there yet, right? So variability and uncertainty are just simply a part of life. Okay, and please don't mistake uncertainty as implying doubt, right? If as we go through this course, if I say to you, well, we're just not certain, okay, it may imply doubt. It may mean like, well, I don't know, right? But uncertainty has a very specific meaning in the sciences and the environmental sciences. And how we deal with that is statistical levels of confidence, right? So it's a quantitative measurement of variability. So all data, for example, have a range of expected values, right? And we think about two important ways of collecting and monitoring and assessing data in a course like this. And so this is the final thought for the morning, right? And that is accuracy and precision, okay? When I was in a whole nother life, when I was young, I was born and raised in South Africa, as I said to you yesterday, and we had to do military service. And in my 2 years of military service, I learned to play darts, okay? So here's a dartboard, and let's say you're playing darts and you've got 4 dots, and on the left is what one distribution looks like, and on the right is what another distribution looks like, okay? These two distributions illustrate these two terms of accuracy and precision. So the one on the left, these 4 dots, are much more accurate than the one on the right, right? Those 4 dots are encircling the bullseye. They are close to the true value, at least in a darts perspective, where you want to be. But if you're collecting data, they are closer to the true value, right? They're not very precise. There's a fair amount of dispersion around there, but they're more accurate than the one on the left. The one on the left, 4 very precise dots, all way offline, right? I'm a golfer, okay? And I'm excellent at hitting balls out of bounds with precision, time after time after time, okay? So think about that as we move through and start, unpacking data sets and things like climate and energy and pollution and ozone and so on. Just have in the back of your mind, I wonder how accurate these measurements, I wonder how precise they are, I wonder how systematic they are, how have they been verified, what is the gold standard of these measurements? Are they being manipulated to fit a particular agenda, or whatever the case may be? So I hope that makes sense. And it is 9:34. So let me end there. We're going to end a good 15 minutes early today, I think. Hopefully you don't get used to it. But I don't have any reason to keep you sitting here just for the sake of sitting here. So let me ask, first off, are there any questions on that? Does that all make sense to you? Any thoughts or comments or questions? All good. I'm going to stop the recording to the cloud.